This is Deb Donig with Technically Human, a podcast about ethics and technology, where I ask what it means to be human in the age of tech. Each week, I interview industry leaders, thinkers, writers, and technologists, and I ask them about how they understand the relationship between humans and the technologies we create. We discuss how we can build a better vision for technology, one that represents the best of our human values.
It is my great pleasure today to bring you a conversation with one of my most important mentors and, to my mind, one of the great thinkers working at the intersection of ethics and technology, Professor Todd Presner, for an episode about the ethics of the algorithm. In the conversation, we talk about new directions in Holocaust memory and scholarship, how technologies are enabling new approaches, questions, and interpretations of major historical events, and how digital technologies might help us imagine a new ethics of interpretation of history and memory. Aside from being one of the thinkers most foundational to my work, Dr. Todd Presner is chair of UCLA's Department of European Languages and Transcultural Studies. Previously, he was the chair of UCLA's Digital Humanities program from 2011 to 2021, and from 2011 to 2018, he served as the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Director of the Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies. He holds the Michael and Irene Ross Chair in the UCLA Division of the Humanities. His research focuses on European intellectual and cultural history, Holocaust studies, visual culture, and digital humanities. Dr. Presner's newest book, Ethics of the Algorithm, Digital Humanities and Holocaust Memory, was published by Princeton University Press this year in fall of 2024. Hi, Todd.
Hi there, Deb.
It's great to have you on the show. It's been a while since I've had you on here, and that conversation was just delightful. So I'm looking forward to another really exciting conversation about your new book. And I wonder if I could just start by asking you to tell us a little bit about the journey you took in conceiving of and writing your new book, which is the subject of our conversation today, The Ethics of the Algorithm, Digital Humanities and Holocaust Memory. So first, what made you decide to write the book? What issues or things that you were seeing or questions served as the engine of the project?
Well, thanks, Deb. This is really a pleasure to be back and to have this conversation with you. And especially, I've been following your work and your podcast for many years, and I do hope that the ideas in this conversation will resonate, with your audience. This is a book that begins actually with the last phrase, Holocaust memory, and it's particularly investigating how that's changed in the digital age. We may think of it as something static or fixed, but it by no means is, and especially because we're in this very interesting and precarious, I'd say, twilight moment, which is the recession of the survivor generation. We'll pretty soon be accessing most of what we know about the Holocaust through various digital modalities, various forms of media and mediation, and, really asks, I think, some real questions as to what that means, what's at stake. I also, utilizing the second word before that, digital humanities, I'm also interested in using those tools and methods, computational methods in particular, to investigate how we conceive of and understand Holocaust memory and history. And that kind of already raises another question, which I think is the central question of the book. How do we do so ethically? Especially because we know that computational tools have the potential not only to dehumanize, but to abstract or reify or turn people into, units of data points. And this is, of course, something that in a case of studying the Holocaust or Holocaust memory is something that we need to be not only cognizant of, but we need to develop ways of engaging, especially engaging using computational tools that are always foregrounding ethical questions. So that's basically where the title of the book, comes from. It's a unique book in a lot of ways in that it's collaborative. Many of my students in the Digital Humanities program are part of the development of the tools and methods, visualizations, and data in the book. They're credited as such, in fact, as co-authors or co-contributors. And the book, as you saw, it's also kind of an augmented book in the sense it has QR codes embedded in it so that people, as you're reading, with your phone or your iPad, you could actually go and play with some of the data visualizations, listen to testimonial segments, access data that we used, that we developed, access code modules, And so it's a kind of an augmented, extended book. And it's in some ways a meditation too on, what it is that historians are doing in terms of like the genre of studying the Holocaust. Most of us, we read, I'd say, more conventional single-authored narratives. Often our work happens in archives. But this is a book that's dealing with history, but it's also dealing with digital humanities tools. It's dealing with critical computation. It's trying to also think, both theorize a set of practices and also to enact, those practices at the same time. The other thing, I would say is it's kind of come into being. You asked about, how did, what was I seeing? Besides, the twilight of the survivor generation, we also exist now, obviously, in a very different world than that of the survivors. We're all becoming, I call in the book, distant witnesses. And that's largely because our understanding of history and even our relationship to the dead is going to be mediated through various kinds of technology. It might be video, it might be databases, it might be, VR, it might be holograms, it might be AI and other forms of synthetic media. But certainly the digital is not going away and more structuring the way in which we engage with and know the past. And so this, again, I think necessitates an engagement both with those tools and technologies that's looking at the ethical issues, looking at the epistemological issues. For me, they go hand in hand. That is to say, questions of ethics and questions of knowing, like how do we know, how do we engage, are also always raising ethical questions about why we do certain things, how we do it, what responsibility we have. Should also, just say that, with regard to ethical questions in the Holocaust, we know, and I mentioned this a little earlier, there's an underbelly to all this, right? The history of biostatistics is part of eugenics. The complicity of the social sciences and the computational sciences, the creation of systems of data to collect information about Jews and to do so in ways to optimize efficiency, right? This is the complicity of computation in the very thing that we're studying, which is the Holocaust. And I would say, you could carry this up to today. There's a different kind of complicity, but it would be corporate platforms, various data harvesting practices, various ways in which that data is being managed, sold, used in ways that are often not particularly consensual. So this is also why, we have to think about algorithmic culture through lenses of ethics.
You already very much anticipated my next question. And I wanted to ask you to kind of pull a thread out of some of the comments that you just made, because on the show, we talk quite a bit about the ethics of algorithms, from bias embedded in algorithmic models to concerns about how and when they're deployed and how much power those people who are subjected to them have to challenge their conclusions. So I'm thinking, for example, of critics like Cathy O'Neill, your colleague Safiya Noble, people who write quite compellingly about the need for example, transparency around both algorithmic deployment as well as transparency into the construction of models themselves. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about what you mean by the ethics of the algorithm in the context of your work specifically. What do you mean specifically by the ethics, again, of the algorithm in the context of your research? Is there something specific about this strange mathematical formula of long division that we might call algorithms that pertains specifically to how we think about Holocaust memory? And I understand, and I've read, a great deal about the ways in which statistics and data are implicated in, for example, the development of census data that allowed the Nazis to round up and deport Jews. I'm wondering about the algorithm specifically and all of the critiques that are out there in the kind of social milieu of criticism about algorithms and the application to thinking about how we construct, understand, metabolize, and foster Holocaust memory in the present.
Oh, thanks, Deb. That's such a fantastic question. And I'm really excited about the ability that we can talk about this and also kind of connect with some of the work that you mentioned, Cathy O'Neill and Safiya Noble. Safiya being a wonderful colleague of mine at UCLA who wrote a book called Algorithms of Oppression, and look particularly at the way in which search engines like Google and just even the whole process of algorithmic culture bakes in various kinds of biases and discriminatory practices that get passed downstream to various other applications. I would also mention the work of Kate Crawford, I think is here on the Atlas AI, where she's looking at how those practices often more than just reify, but potentially replicate and reinforce biases. And that is a portion of what I'm after in the book. I'm certainly looking at ways in which AI and algorithms have that potentiality. And sometimes it's very much in the structure of how the algorithm operates, or the training data that's used, or the way in which the embeddings are calculated, and so forth. But what I'm trying to also do in the book is something a bit different. And I guess I would phrase this as an approach to ethics in light of algorithms. So we live in an algorithmic culture. We're suffused in everything we do with computational forms of structuring information, accessing information, collecting information, analyzing information. And in many ways, when we talk about ethics, what we really mean, and kind of go back to Aristotle here, is, we're talking about character and behavior. Now, what's interesting about algorithms is that they are agents that make decisions. I mean, it used to be, we say humans are the agents that make decisions about what we should and shouldn't do. And that's an ethical question, right? So I ought to do this, or I ought not to do that. Well, algorithms are also making decisions and have a kind of agency. I don't think it's quite an ethical or moral agency yet, but potentially that's coming. And so I really think that, I said earlier, algorithms raise epistemological and ethical questions. Well, how do they do that? They do that in their formal function, that is, how they arrange data, how they transform data, how they parse data, but also how they get trained on data, right? So in their operations, there are baked in ethical questions in the function of algorithms and in their consequences. This is really interesting because it's quite different than traditional ethics. Traditional, say Kantian ethics, deontological ethics would look at the principles that inform our actions. Like we have a duty, for example, to moral laws that could eventually be universalized, or utilitarian ethics, greatest good for the greatest number or the least amount of harm. These are all kind of human-centered modalities of thinking about ethics. But now we have machine, let's just say, not about machine-centered, but let's say machine-informed approaches. So how do we think about those questions of what we should and shouldn't do? How do we think about questions of judgment and responsibility, how we treat others, even the responsibility to engage with, say, survivors of the Holocaust? That responsibility has traditionally been, listening to the story, sitting face to face with a survivor, reflecting on what it means. And so, what does it mean that those stories are coming to us via computational platforms, through various kinds of digital archives, or that I could use algorithmic forms to listen or attend or even expand my understanding of those stories. So that's, I think one of the questions, at the heart of this book are the question of like a machine-human assemblage with regard to ethics. That is to say, we don't need to outsource human judgment to algorithms, or if we do, we need to be particularly attuned to doing that. But it does potentially change the way we listen. It does potentially change the way we know about or engage with the past, or the ways we're responsible to the dead, and what we know of them, how we think about, how we characterize or understand the past. For me, one of the possibilities of developing this idea of an ethics of the algorithm is that it expands our way of knowing, our way of thinking, our ways of researching, our disposition toward the past and to one another. And this is a little bit different, than models that, primarily attuned to questions of, fate is often the way ethics and algorithm talking about fairness, accountability, transparency, explainability. And I think that's absolutely critical, no question about it. But what I'm also trying to do is that we need to think about ethical questions in light of algorithms, and not in the way that I think traditionally we've thought about them, from Aristotle to Kant, to Levinas. We are obligated, I think, to think about what kind of ethical questions are raised when we have decision makers, agents, machines that are also informing potentially how we judge and what we know. And so ethics of the algorithm in this way is kind of aspirational, right? It's a future-directed thing. One day, I think we'll be able to talk about and ethics of the algorithm, because we know that these computational approaches, whether it's to counting or measuring or calculating, but I would say attention. Attention is actually one of the really key terms about how most transformer-based algorithms work. They attend to certain things, whether it's in a sentence or an image or what have you, by assigning importance and weight. I mean, algorithms perceive certain things, and they don't use their eyes or their judgment or their experiences of, at least their embodied experiences as we do, to do so. And so, for me, the question of these attention mechanisms is precisely about how importance and weight and perception operates in algorithmic cultures. So this is it's a very different, I think, approach to ethics, and it's one that I think is urgent. We're thinking about ethics in light of algorithms. We're thinking of these behaviors and characteristics, perhaps virtues, even and especially decisions, in light of what algorithms perceive and what they potentially can do. So that's what an ethics of the algorithm, involves. It involves certainly thinking about critical algorithm studies in terms of understanding limitations, biases, discriminatory practices, but it's also thinking, future-wise, is that algorithms are part of this human-machine assemblage with regard to ethical questions, and we need to develop something that I think recognizes the changed circumstances, the changed world that we're in, and it's certainly a world where we're not the only decision makers anymore.
You said a lot of really interesting things that I want to circle back to here, not the least of which is the question that we will most assuredly get to later, which is how our new computational technologies are changing our understanding of ethics and perhaps intervening into and changing the course of conversations that we've been having for centuries or millennia, and thinking about the new potential directions that our technologies may take us. But before we get there, I do want to ask a question about how you're linking your previous work with this current work. And as anyone who follows your work knows, you've been involved in questions related to Holocaust memory for a long time. And for listeners, just a little peek behind the curtain so that you can see the history of the conversation behind this conversation. I took a course of yours, Todd, back when I was a graduate student at UCLA on the topic of Holocaust memory, and that was more years ago than I care to admit, but I will let you in on the secret that it was more than a decade ago. And when I was at UCLA in that graduate program, you convened what was perhaps the most important scholarly conversation on 21st century Holocaust memory, which some of the most important thinkers contributing to Holocaust scholarship at the time participated in, and that was titled Probing the Ethics of Holocaust Culture, which took place in about 2013 or so, if I'm remembering correctly. So also over a decade ago, after which you published a version of the talks presented at that conference by major scholars in the field. And at that conference, we talked, and the larger conference was pivoted around questions related to Holocaust memory. And there was a kind of marginal gesture toward thinking about the technologies and the ethics involved in the engagement with Holocaust memory at the intersection of technology. But those questions really weren't the focus then. And now questions of technologies, if I look at the landscape of where Holocaust memory and Holocaust studies is situated, occupy somewhat of the center, I want to say, just from a kind of skimming of that scholarship, rather than the kind of periphery of that conversation. And I'm interested in thinking about this current book in light of that previous work and the trajectory of your thinking. What's changed in the past decade about Holocaust memory such that digital technologies represent the new focus of these ethical questions? Is it just that we have more of these technologies, or they occupy more of our attention or more of our general kind of milieu? Or has there been a specific kind of trajectory or direction within Holocaust memory that has engaged these technologies in a particular way?
Again, thanks, Deb. This is such a great question, and really, I love the way you also kind of knit it together with some of the, historical moments that were really critical, I think, for how we think about Holocaust, culture, questions of representation, and really, I think even the status of the Holocaust, in terms of public perception and historical studies. One of, we just take some examples of sort of what, digital technologies, are informing, let's just say, our understanding of the Holocaust in just the last couple of years. And I see an interesting proliferation of the use of these technologies by museums and archives, and I'd say public culture, more generally. You have, very famously, like the Dimensions in Testimony project, which is developed by the USC Shoah Foundation, and that came out around 2014. So right around that time, just after the book was imagined, that came out of this conference. That book, I think, was published in 2016, The Probing the Ethics of Holocaust Culture. But Dimensions in Testimony was originally conceived as holograms, the ability to interact by users asking questions to a holographically generated survivor who had a series of pre-recorded answers, actually quite a number, sometimes thousands of pre-recorded answers, and a machine learning algorithm was developed to figure out which answer to play and try to understand the meaning and intention of what the user's asking. That's, a fascinating project, and it's been expanded to other areas beyond the Holocaust, including the Nanjing Massacre. You have recently the Anne Frank House developing virtual reality tours of the annex. You have, of course, anxieties over like ChatGPT and AI making up Holocaust testimony or even just disinformation. You can type into ChatGPT, to create a Holocaust testimony, and you'll get essentially at least the outlines of something that looks like a testimony. But it's obviously not based on any experience, since, of course, the AI didn't go through anything, personally. You have the use of immersive VR films by the Illinois Museum of the Holocaust, for example, looking at like A Promise Kept is one, which is a VR film with survivor Fritzi Fritzschall. Another one, Don't Forget Me, with the survivor George Brent. You put on the Oculus headset and you can go into the deportation train with Fritzi Fritzschall or with George Brent. You can go into the barracks. You can visit Auschwitz, right? So this sense of presence or kind of immediacy is, I think, also indicative of maybe both an anxiety, but also I think just a reality of the distance that the Holocaust has now geographically and temporally. Right? There are going to be very few survivors left. And so these technologies then become possibilities for mediation. But they raise all kinds of interesting, questions about ethical questions, right? What does it mean to wear the Oculus headset and take, say, photographs and add soundtracks to them? That's really interesting because we know, of course, photos don't have soundtracks. What does it mean to have a VR experience or to engage with an algorithm that's making the decision about what answer to play when a user asks a question? The survivor's not the one making that decision anymore. It's the algorithm. So these are, I think, questions really that I think highlight the ways in which digital technologies are changing the way in which we interact with and know about the Holocaust. And, if I was to look, kind of even long term, you mentioned Probing the Ethics of Holocaust Culture. And before that, there was another famous conference by Saul Friedlander called Probing the Limits of Representation. And I think that there's still something there about this question of limits of representation that's important. At the time, this is like in the 1990s, the Holocaust was kind of a test case, for postmodernism, for relativism. Aren't there absolute truths that are out there? Are there potentially, unacceptable modes of talking about these historical events? Like, can we talk about the Holocaust using the trope or the genre of the comedy, for example? Well, then you get a film like, Life is Beautiful, which does exactly that. Or you get counterfactual stories like Inglourious Bastards, right, from 2009. So imagining a kind of what if approach to, the destruction of Hitler and the Nazis. These are ways in which film as a medium, and of course the storytelling connected to it, raises questions about how we represent historical events, what kind of decisions are made by screenwriters, by directors, by editors. And I should be honest, film, of course, is always, it's a medium that we're used to with regard to understanding the Holocaust. Certainly, we maybe know Claude Lanzmann's film Shoah as this great film about witnessing, but there's also tremendous amount of decision-making that went in not only to who to interview, but also how to conduct those interviews, all the scripting that was involved in creating these scenes. And those are the decision moments. And for me, so much about what's interesting about these technologies, but also, I'd say film is one of those technologies, VR is one of these technologies, digital archives or technologies, even historical writing, technologies. Narrative is still a technology. But the point is that there's always lots of decisions, mostly human-made decisions about what to represent, how to edit, how to cut, how to script. And now the technologies are also making some of those decisions, what to play, what answer to play, how are we going to engage with this? And my whole point is that in order to develop an ethics of algorithms, again, it goes back to that human-machine assemblage, we have to examine these decision moments. Those decision moments get embedded in the technologies in terms of how they operate. Even a technology like ChatGPT, in order to get the helpful preferred outputs, there's a lot of training that had to happen. A lot of reinforcement learning is what they call it, where human labelers and human evaluators gave and also framed certain ways in which the large language models operate. Those are all ethical and epistemological decision moments. And that's really what I'm getting at this book, is really trying to highlight the importance of those things because they have such consequence for how we relate to either the past or understand or know about and really kind of, I'd say, even commemorate, right? Something like the Holocaust.
This is all very helpful because I think that I'm getting the sense from you that what we're seeing in this digital culture is both perhaps a replication of older questions. I'm also getting the sense that there may be something new that digital culture raises in terms of thinking about the kinds of ethical questions we want to attend to when we think about Holocaust memory. And I guess that's my question, because I'm thinking, about what you've said about large language models or what we pay attention to. These are interpretive or epistemological questions as pertaining to Holocaust testimony. These are all questions that scholars have spent an immense amount of time and ink on in thinking about Holocaust memory. Which testimonies we read, how we present them, what kinds of contexts or genres we want to include them within, how to focus on the kind of microscopic details, which we'll get to later, of an individual text and explicate them in ways that tell us more about the meaning of the text as a whole. But I think the question that comes up for you here is, are the questions that come up about the ethics of the algorithm fundamentally new ethical questions about Holocaust representation and memory that we need to newly address in the digital age, given the digital tools we have available to analyze Holocaust testimony and memory, things like large language models and algorithms and the storage capacities of where we house Holocaust memory? Or are these updated questions or new iterations of much older questions that have animated Holocaust scholarship for decades? I guess maybe we should talk first about what those fundamental questions in the context of the ethics of Holocaust representation are first, before we get into the question of what marks digital representations or digital analysis specifically. So before we get into the question that I just asked, which I'll pose to you again so that you can have it newly and clean in your mind, can you first characterize the questions that animate, or the primary question, because there are so many, what questions animate the ethical concerns about Holocaust memory in your view? What are the fundamental ones?
I think that, there are a number of fundamental questions that I think have animated both Holocaust memory over, the last several decades. And there are actually books on this, like The Ethics of History or The Ethics of Remembering or The Ethics of Memory. And so in some way, when I talk about the ethics of the algorithm, I'm also in the background, thinking of these kind of approaches. And I think a question of what is new. But what does an ethics of remembering or an ethics of memory mean in the context of the Holocaust? Well, in some ways, I think it means an obligation to understand the past, right? To truthfully, I think, maybe make sense of it, to inscribe those voices, to give voice to the nameless dead, a responsibility for speaking on behalf of the dead, right? This is, questions that animate historians who want to do justice to the dead, who can't testify on their own. So responsibility to the past, what responsibility do we have to making sense of it, to memorializing it, to making it knowable? And I'd say, these are questions that animate at every level, from a historical work to a museum to an archive, right? There's an aspect of, obviously selection principles are at place here, right? We can't know everything. And that also raises interesting questions, right? What ultimately is displayed? How is it displayed? How do people interact with these histories? There's a kind of hermeneutics there. And that hermeneutics is about, interpreting the past, explaining it, making it understandable. I would say also drawing lessons, right? Like, what is the meaning of it? Why should we learn about the Holocaust? Why did my 8th grader read Maus and understand, what Art Spiegelman was trying to do? And that there's also even, thinking about the form of a graphic novel. That's an aspect of, I think, Holocaust history and Holocaust memory. And again, the ethical issues there are probably transgenerational memory, right? The idea of passing on a story and trying to understand it, I'd say, accurately and fairly and factually, but also noticing that there's a limit. That is to say, we can't go back and ask the dead. We can't really get it absolutely how it was, but there's a whole process by which Holocaust memory work is, I'd say, long-standing narrative work and thinking about questions of representation, moral imperatives, perhaps of speaking for the voiceless, obligations to listen, again, maybe through a lens like that of the ethical philosopher Emmanuel Levinas. I would mention like Edith Visegrád's work of a kind of an approach to an ethics of remembering is what she calls it, and very much inflected by the Holocaust as something that demands not only knowledge, but I'd say a relationship, right? And that relationship comes, often through the voices of testimony, and an openness of the historian or the philosopher or the thinker or just any one of us, right, to listen. This is a kind of an obligation of sorts to be open to that story. Now, of course, the second part of your question, which I think, you want to say or talk about, but is really, what does it mean for the computer or the algorithm to be open, if it can be, to the story of the other? What does it mean to think about algorithms as helping to either listen or to do some of this interpretive work? And there we get to, I think, some really interesting questions as to how humans and algorithmic or computational approaches can perhaps provide some new insights into how we think about Holocaust history and memory. And that, of course, is at the core of the book.
So in your view, are the questions that you're asking about the ethics of using these technologies primarily about the ethics of deploying them on Holocaust material to the ends of representing or interrogating the Holocaust as a specific event? Or are the questions you ask about the ethics of using these technologies more universally situated? I guess I'm asking, how portable are the ideas that you seek after in your book? Are they specific to Holocaust testimony or even to histories and experiences of atrocity or suffering, if we want to broaden that category slightly? Or are they kind of universal questions about the ethics of algorithms writ large?
Right. Well, in the book, I reference the philosopher of history, Hayden White, who talks about something that he calls holocaustal events. So he's not talking just about the Holocaust, but he's talking about other events of the scope and scale and human impact like the Holocaust. An example would be the history of the transatlantic of slavery and all the 36,000 slave ships that came across over 350 years, of which we have a lot of data. That raises a series of other ethical questions. How do we look at that history, especially because no single scholar can get their mind, I think, around the size, the scale, the complexity of multiple centuries, billions of lives, thousands and thousands of slave ships. And I think there's something analogous there with regard to scale and scope with regard to like the Holocaust. You also have, some similarities with regard to the reduction of human beings to numbers, right? The whole questions of numeracy. There's a couple other ways that I think the ideas apply, more broadly. And that, mentioned this with regard to algorithmic culture more generally, is I think a lot of the discussion around algorithms and ethics or morality is kind of driven by the idea that ethics is a kind of like a recipe or a kind of a sense of, well, here's a checklist of things that we need to do, and then we'll have ethical algorithms. And I don't think that's the right understanding here. I don't think that morality is something that gets encoded into an algorithmic process and then we're done, and that then the algorithm is going to make good choices that are moral as opposed to bad choices that are immoral. There's certainly an ethical algorithms, and those should be confronted, especially, say, surveillance and other things. But ethics is more complicated because it's not a state of being, but it's a dynamic responsibility or a relationship of responsibility to something, to other people, to the past, to the dead. Ethics requires thinking and reflecting and judging and really kind of looking at all those decision moments that give rise to what we know or how we engage with others. I mean, And in many ways, the book is calling for what does it mean to live with algorithms, right? How do we live with algorithms? How do they expand our thinking? How can they be used to attune our perception? How can they deepen our understanding? How can they help do interpretive work? Which is very different than I've created an algorithm that now does moral things versus an algorithm does immoral things. It's not as simple as that. And it would be a mistake, I think, to talk about ethics in terms of just mathematical decision-making. At the same time, I very much am calling for an assemblage that humans are not the only decision agents anymore, and that we need to imagine a world suffused by algorithmic processes because those decision agents extend beyond human decision-making. It's a kind of responsibility of working in a world with new forms of, say, attention. A worst case scenario, you might think of like an algorithm makes a decision about, like a drone, who to kill, or perhaps, makes recommendations to a police department, what neighborhood to survey, a particular day more. But again, for me, some of the ethical questions would be how can one speak back to this algorithm? How can one participate in more dynamic situations of responsibility? What does it mean? We don't want to reduce people, again, to just pieces of data that can be managed, right? Instead, it's about using algorithms in ways that expand our thinking, that care, that perhaps even come up with reparative approaches to histories of dehumanization. That I think is really something that's portable and hopefully would inform, some of the discussion around ethics and algorithms and really recast it, I think, in some really, I think, central and different ways.
Can you give us an example from your book or from your research broadly of how you're viewing digital tools as assistants that help us understand the experience or the history of the Holocaust differently or turn up new understandings or new answers to age-old questions?
Well, the book, the other half of the book, I'd say, or most of the book is really about exploring a set of practices of using computational tools on different archives of Holocaust testimony. And those are, there's different kind of questions that we're asking, but I'd say they're all informing historical approaches, humanistic approaches that hopefully are able to deepen our understanding of some of our knowledge already of the Holocaust. So, one idea in the book is I was particularly interested in questions around survivors talking about what they did and what was done to them. So questions of agency. And if you look at or listen to any Holocaust testimony, you're going to hear survivors talk a lot about what they did under certain circumstances, what Nazis or other occupiers did to them. And one of the things that's very hard to understand or extract are these kind of micro-level histories of resistance. We generally know like kind of the large scale of what people did. Of course, we know those context too of what was done, people being put in ghettos and deportation trains and so forth, being dehumanized in different ways. But I was interested in the fact that maybe we could use natural language processing to work through thousands of testimonial transcripts and identify these micro-histories of resistance, like these very small things that people say in passing, like spilling ink onto another kid in a school in response to an anti-Semitic, incident, or fighting children in a neighborhood using chestnuts from a tree, or in one case, a survivor talking about the radio. The Nazis forbade Jews from having radios. They either had to turn them in or destroy them. And what some survivors remember is, the actual taking an axe to the radio, chopping it up into pieces and putting it down the drain, which is a fascinating example of kind of historical, defiance and resistance. And there's many, many more in the book that we talk about. And one of the ideas here is, you can use information extraction, you can use natural language processing to extract these, to take the transcripts, turn them into almost like we call paratexts, that is to say, documents that look at different kinds of agency and how that agency is expressed, and then create network diagrams that help us understand how people tell their stories, what kind of agency they thought they had, what agency others had. And this, helps us to appreciate some of these smaller acts that may have gone unindexed or unknown. Another example of this is to kind of build. So instead of going small, we go big, which is, ask, how do 1,000 survivors, or more remember anti-Semitism in the 1930s and early 1940s? How do they say they responded? what can it mean to think in these kind of larger aggregates, I introduced the term in the book called a testimonial ensemble. And that's a term that comes from one of my co-authors, Kyle Rosen. And the idea being that it's a kind of, rather than seeing testimonies as just singular witnesses talking about what they experienced, what we're looking at are, can you bring many different testimonies together in order for us to understand a historical event, like something as large as the history of anti-Semitism in Europe in the late 30s or 40s, or for that matter, a particular person who doesn't have a testimony. And in the book, I focus on one particular victim, a woman named Mala Zemetbaum, who I first learned about actually from some of the recorded testimonies that David Boder did in 1946 in the displaced persons camp. And Boder is very interesting and important figure in the history of Holocaust testimony because he was the first person to record the voices of Holocaust survivors using what was called at the time a wire recorder. So it's actually on wire. And he brought this device into displaced persons camps in 1946 in Germany and Switzerland and France and Italy and talked to survivors. Two of them mentioned, and they don't get the name quite right, this Mali Zemetbaum or Mali Zemetbaum. And they're both Yiddish language testimonies. And I was struck by the fact that they talk about this person who had escaped Auschwitz, had actually donned SS uniforms, and then was caught and brought back, and in a kind of spectacular fashion was hung or killed by Maria Mandel, who was the SS officer in charge of the women's section of Auschwitz. And they both had different accounts of this, but they weren't quite the same. And then I looked a little further and found that there's actually dozens and dozens of people that talk about this, woman named Mala Zemetbaum. And the idea was to use computational tools to bring together these different testimonies. There are many things that aligned, many things that actually were the same, and then there's some things that were different. And so the idea was a kind of a polyphonic testimony of someone whose voice is erased from the historical record, but computational tools can help us to begin to understand where the differences are, bring together all those different voices as a kind of approach to kind of algorithmic fabulation. And I referenced the work of Saadia Hartman here. And Mala Zemetbaum is in many ways a kind of an Antigone-like figure. She, rather than be killed, she slit her wrist with a razor. It's very famously, these women remember this moment of defiance that, rather than be killed, I'd rather kill myself. I'll take my own life, my own agency. And these women, dozens and dozens of witnesses, relay this memory in the Holocaust testimonies. And so that's an example as well of where the kind of this approach to these more integrated methodologies, historical, archival, computational, can help us to learn something in the archive or learn more about the testimonies, almost to enhance our listening or expand our listening in new ways. And this is something that I'm constantly trying to do in the book with computational tools.
So this is fascinating. I can see from your answer that scholars are finding new answers to questions that they've previously asked about the history. I want to kind of flip that and invert it. Are these new technologies leading scholars to ask fundamentally new questions or new kind of categories of questions about these histories?
Right. Well, I think, one of the things that digital tools enable is certainly an encounter with scale, right? So that we're able to work with many more, whether it's thousands of testimonies and information extraction processes, network visualizations. We used another example of something we did with my colleague Michelle Lee was we used a machine learning algorithm to characterize in-review questions. What did people actually ask survivors, right? We mostly talk about the answers, but we haven't really talked about the questions. And it turns out the questions that David Boder asked survivors in 1946 were really very different than the questions that the Fortunoff archive questioners were asking in the late 70s or early 80s and onward, and also very different than what the USC Shoah Foundation asked in the 1990s and 2000s. And it turns out also really different than what, users are asking in the Dimensions and Testimony project. How can we use, in some ways, use machine learning to help us to characterize those changes, right? To understand the semantic, differences and similarities of the questions, to also characterize even tone and what's being occluded in questions. And so, it's a different approach in that regard. It's an approach, I think, to oral history using computational tools. We also propose in the book, ideas around counter indexing is what I call it. So, when we index things, usually human beings are the ones tagging the stuff. We mark up stuff, right? The history of human-created markup is very important for us to understand the content of digital documents. Of course, machines also, again, thinking about that attention mechanisms, right? They'll attend to certain things, recognize certain things, can also develop approaches or models like topic modeling and other things to help us to index and find new things. I'm interested in indexing agency, for example. I'm interested in also indexing linguistic expressions about how people tell their stories, in terms of, those things like maybe what they don't feel comfortable talking about or saying or can't say, or perhaps don't even translate into language. I'm also interested in the phonetic dimension. I'm interested in those paralinguistic cues that may be in testimony, like silences or stuttering or code switching, all things that I think would help us to appreciate not just the grain of the voice, like what people say, but that whole process of how they put these memories into a testimonial form. So these are, some of the practices, right, that again, help us to, I think, ask new questions in Holocaust studies and in many ways, I hope, provide kind of like, almost like I'd say maybe it's a model, but certainly not by any means the model for how historical work may make use of these integrated methods. Again, computational and humanistic, statistical and data-driven, and narrative, critique. Distant and close, these are all kind of integrated approaches that I think are indicative of a different kind of way of thinking and framing, historical questions.
Well, I'm glad that you brought up the Dimensions in Testimony project because I've been looking to ask you about that project. You write about it in the book, and we previously had Dr. Stephen Smith on this show talking about that project. And for listeners of this episode, definitely go back and check out the archive of this show for that episode, which is in so many ways conversant with this current episode. And check that out for a full discussion of the ethics of that project specifically. Just to provide a synopsis of that project, it's based on a massive undertaking to record testimony from individual survivors in the forms of questions and answers from that particular living survivor, and to combine this with a massive digital set of projections that allow people to engage with what we might call, and Stephen does not like this term, but I'll use it anyway because I think it's the most tangible term, a hologram of a Holocaust survivor whom audiences can interact with in real time in dialogue. And that project is an attempt to provide these kinds of interactions that previous generations had with Holocaust survivors to that next generation and future generations at the stage where Holocaust survivors are no longer alive to tell their stories. Again, for listeners, go back and check out that episode for a more in-depth conversation of that project. But Todd, I wanted to, since you covered that project in your book, ask you specifically about how you view the project. I had Stephen on the show way back when, in the age before large language models made conversations with archives and chatbots based on massive amounts of data more or less a feature of our current society. And maybe today the novelty of that project has worn off a bit given the relative ubiquitousness of generative AI, ChatGPT, etc., to the point where we can talk about what this project seems to actually accomplish and what the limitations or ethical questions might be, not speculatively or hypothetically as we did in that conversation, but actually. How do you see the ethics of this project specifically in our moment, given the broader conversation that our society is having about the ethics of ChatGPT, et cetera, and the ethics of anthropomorphizing ChatGPT as well as its use of and projections of information from that database?
Yeah, no, these are great questions, Deb. Thanks for letting me talk a little bit about it. And indeed, you're right. It was initially conceived as a hologram, at least in the first case when the first survivor, a man named Pinchas Guter, was interviewed. But I think the term that the Shoah Foundation prefers, and I think this term also makes quite a bit of sense, is volumetrically captured testimony, mostly because it's captured from every different side, using over 100 camera angles.
Doesn't quite roll off the tongue.
No, it doesn't quite roll off the tongue, does it? Yeah. But it does kind of indicate that the survivor can be turned into a projection that you can walk around, right? That is, and it has that interactive dimension. So interactive biography is another term that they like. But I mean, the more interesting part to me is less about the projection. That's actually how the technology works. And it's a little different than it's not an AI making up answers, although we do have examples of this. There are apps out there like Hello History, where I can basically on my phone, ask any question I want to Anne Frank or Paul von Hindenburg, and theoretically, actually get ChatGPT-like answers. This is a very different thing. The Dimensions in Testimony project is not that. And I think it's an important kind of a distinction that we need to make. What Dimensions in Testimony does is it really delinks questions from answers and allows users to really steer the conversation. And where the machine learning aspect is coming in is it's coming in from the parsing of the question. So you have essentially a survivor sitting before you, or perhaps in a museum setting, perhaps on your computer, and you can begin by asking the survivor questions. As the machine learning algorithm figures out what you're asking, it's going to select from a finite database of answers. And in this case, it's not a small database. It's often thousands of answers, what the best answer is to your question. But what's interesting about that is the algorithm goes back to decision making, right? The algorithm is being trained. There's confidence scores that are given to the decisions that are made. Humans can go in and create it, can fine tune it. In fact, it takes around 10,000 questions and answers before the Watson system, which is their IBM machine learning system, for every survivor seems to be pretty good at providing the best possible answer from this finite pre-recorded database of answers. And again, that's the difference there, is the AI component is really on the matching. It's not in the creation. There's no synthetic answers that are coming. It's not generating any new answers. Now, fast forward, that's not really a big fast forward because we're talking about the last couple of years. You have language models that basically can do something quite similar. One of the things I did with one of my classes is I, provided some background from publicly available material about Pinchas Guder to ChatGPT and asked it to respond as if you were talking to Pinchas Guder. And this is, GPT 3.5 and 4. Not only is it, I would say, eerie, but it's also not quite accurate. And this is, I think, at the heart of the matter, is that testimony is a very uniquely human genre of attestation that is based on experience, right? And that the idea is that you're translating experiences into forms of representation, primarily language, narrative, but also, of course, art or music, and it's created for someone to hear. ChatGPT can make up a Holocaust testimony based on whatever training data exists in there, and it's actually pretty interesting that I think it has an understanding of the genre of Holocaust testimony as it exists today, primarily because there's a lot of material that's publicly available that would have been part of the corpus of data that it's trained on. But what it does is it's kind of like the central tendency issue, which is I think it provides a typical example of a Holocaust testimony, where it provides a typical example of how a survivor, theoretically may answer. And it turns out that it's completely different than how the survivor actually really did answer. So when you test it out, I asked a question, for example, about forgiveness. And the answer that ChatGPT gave me was, yes, of course, it's very hard to forgive Nazis. But at the end of the day, I think that, it's an individual decision and we should do so. Well, if you ask Pinchas Guder whether he forgives Nazis, his answer is hell no. And it's very emphatic and it's very strong. And it's simply so dissonant, from the answer that the AI actually gives. I mean, the AI only knows the past. And I say only the past because it's trained on whatever data from the past is there. It can't testify to anything experiential. It can't testify to anything embodied. It can't testify, obviously, to events that haven't happened. And if it is being asked to make something up, that question, not just of authenticity, but of any kind of reference to an embodied experience is obviously absent, or if it's there, it's only in the tiniest fragments of how the embeddings figure out what token, to predict in a sequence. This would be a very, very fundamentally different approach that I don't think at the end of the day, an AI can testify. And that I think is, again, I think that testimony is a uniquely human genre. AI can help us, I'd say, parse testimonies and maybe make sense of them. It can help us do analytical work, but at the end of the day, an AI should not be making up Holocaust testimonies, or for that matter, any testimony that relates to or is derived from human experience. That's a line, too, that the Shoah Foundation, with regard to authenticity, will also draw. I think that's an important line when we're talking about, historical events, and we're talking about the need, I think, especially in an age, suffused, as you know, with misinformation and disinformation. I think it's an important line that we maintain.
In preparation for this conversation, you and I were talking about the long history of ethical questions, some of which we've already discussed here, related to Holocaust representation. And foremost among the ethical conclusions to those questions, deliberated by generations at this point of Holocaust scholars, is a certain philosophical mandate, I want to say, that ethical engagement with Holocaust testimony, that is to say, thinking about how we can think about and represent and understand the experience of those who suffered through or were victims of that event, is the idea that part of the violence of that event involved turning individuals into numbers or into data. And you've talked at length already about that. But this feature of Holocaust memory and Holocaust history, emblematized by the Nazi strategy of tattooing numbers on the arms of Jewish prisoners in death camps such as Auschwitz, is a feature of that atrocity that we deeply understand as an attempt to strip away their humanity and their individuality and their personhood. Now, as an aside, I'm not sure that I actually agree with that statement, which seems to be taken for granted. After all, it's not evident to me, at least, that we, by using the tools that are associated with the violence, are potentially inherently replicating that violence. Because I'm not sure that the violence of the Holocaust really was that people were transformed into numbers, but much more so that that transformation was used to the ends of violence. For example, I'm not sure that we use numbers in ways that do transform people into them in ways that are inherently violent. I, for example, have a social security number. I have an employee ID number. I have a driver's license number. I'm not sure that those things are inherently violent. I don't see that there is a particular ethical stake there, but nonetheless, this is a standpoint taken for granted, as I said, of Holocaust philosophy and Holocaust ethics. And to that end, philosophers such as, most famously, as you've mentioned, Emmanuel Levinas and others emerged with theories about the true kind of ethics of this event involving an encounter with the other, a face-to-face encounter, where one has to recognize the individuality and otherness in the individual through a close, singular encounter with another person's humanity. This is also a strain of thinking present in the work of people like Dory Laub, Shoshana Fellman, many others who investigate Holocaust testimony and come up with this kind of set of philosophical and ethical principles that we, at this stage, take as granted of how to properly ethically witness trauma, all of which involve the act of bearing direct witness to another story with a kind of set of assumptions that in so doing, we elevate the individual story as a way to return humanity to those individual victims who were stripped of that humanity. You've talked a little bit about how the ethics of big data-driven interpretations of Holocaust archives grapple with that deeply embedded set of ethical principles, but I want to return to that to ask about your work or the capacity of digital tools to, quote, read Holocaust testimony, as you suggested, challenge any of these assumptions, and I would argue the axiomatic principles, that is to say, axiomatic from the standpoint of the bedrock assumptions of Holocaust memory and Holocaust ethics. And if so, how do these tools challenge that kind of philosophy? Also, as a part two of that question, if you are so able to answer it, what if we flip that question and sort of ask an inverse? Does your work in Holocaust memory and digital technologies change some of the bedrock assumptions about algorithmic ethics? And if so, how?
No, thanks, Deb. That's a great question. And I clearly I agree with you that numbers are not inherently dehumanizing. In fact, I wouldn't be talking about ethics of the algorithm if I thought that only thing that algorithmic approaches or data approaches or statistical approaches or, number-informed computational approaches, whether it's measurement or computing trends or patterns or clusters, if that was always inherently dehumanizing, then the book wouldn't exist. But what I am trying to do is say that certainly those approaches that are number-based, that are reductive and potentially abstractionist can be used as a means to dehumanize. And I certainly will want to say and acknowledge, and I do in the book, is talking about the ways in which, whether it's a Nazi census or the idea of putting dots on a map in order to facilitate, expeditious deportations or locate a workforce of a certain age and certain capacity. This is the reduction of people, to just mere data points, right? Bare data, as in nothing but data, as a kind of a non-consensual approach. I didn't consent to being reduced to bare data being used as a means for some other end. In this case, let's say putting together a workforce or deportation, or even corporate platforms that may want to have a certain number of data points, often not in a reductive way, but as many data points as possible in order to track or make perhaps recommendations or to do things that are even more violent or things that are potentially violent, like, say, carry out an execution, like a drone. In any case, what I'm trying to do is say that we need to think a lot more complexly about numbers and about computation. And when we do so, we also have a chance to rethink some of, I think, these fundamental assumptions that are built into both, like, philosophers like Levinas's face-to-face encounter of the individual, that the individual becomes responsible for the other, this kind of singular encounter. And you're very much right that, scholars like Dori Laub and Shoshana Feldman and many others in Holocaust studies link the ethics of that field to the individuality and singularity of that encounter, the duty to listen, as Jeffrey Hartman, who was one of the co-founders of the Fortunoff Archive, talks about it. The problem, of course, is that there's a problem of how do you listen to 50,000 testimonies? What is big data or the possibilities of big data enable? And how can we perhaps, rather than just listening closely, how can we maybe listen from a distance, as Franco Moretti, a literary scholar, talks about? How do we listen to those non-canonical testimonies, right? We may know a handful, maybe our capacities for apprehension and comprehension are probably limited to a few hundred testimonies at most, maybe just a dozen or so. But how do we listen to thousands and thousands? And so we need to develop, I think, ethical approaches that utilize statistical approaches, computational approaches that allow us to find patterns or recognize commonalities or differences and particularities from a large archive of sources. And I'm talking about here in the scale of petabytes of video, right? It's a huge amount of material that these digital archives have in Holocaust studies. We're talking about 50,000 plus testimonies. We're talking about hundreds of millions of words in dozens and dozens of languages. And as a footnote, I will mention that this book, that I wrote, is primarily working with English, German, Yiddish, a certain amount of Ladino and French testimonies, but there are entire testimonies that we don't work with in other languages, Polish, Russian, Ukrainian, among others. And so there's a lot of room, for future work that would work, with testimonies in other languages. But I think the bigger issue here is that processes of distant reading or distant analysis, big data, as you call it, do allow us to attend. And I go back to that question around attentions. I think that's so much about the ethics of the algorithm is how algorithmic approaches attend to different things, perceive or attune us to differences, maybe things that are underappreciated, maybe to patterns that we can't visualize or see, maybe particularities in the archive that have not come forward in the traditional indexing systems or in the conventional stories that we've heard. And I think that, I would reference my colleagues' work in the digital humanities with regard to digital mapping, like the work of Ann Knowles and Paul Jascott and others, who are also using kind of, geographic information systems to understand the spatial aspects of the Holocaust, from a distance, right? At the level of cities or at the level of continents, right? So, of course, we can zoom into, a particular individual experience in a household, and we can hear an individual testimony. But it's also important to understand the event at all these different scales, right? At the level of the block, at the level of the city, at the level of the country. And it's really through computational tools that are modeling environments, that are helping understand what people could have seen, what they could have heard, what they could have known, or even the idea of having, again, thousands of witnesses, provide information about a mass atrocity event. These raise huge questions for legal scholarship, for historical scholarship, and they change, I think, the way in which we're thinking about ethical responsibility. In many ways, I think there's an ethics of distant listening or an ethics of distant reading that is enabled by computational approaches. And that's actually, I think, really quite radical because most of what has been written about is essentially what a historian can possibly keep in his or her mind when they're writing a narrative about something. And it's a limited body of canonical, or maybe less than canonical, but in any case, a selected number of sources. And at the end of the day, what computational tools can do is really expand the purview of the kind of questions that we can ask. And I think in that expansion, there's, real, very interesting and exciting possibilities for expanding the way that we're thinking about ethical questions.
Yeah, I think exciting is the right word here. And this, to me, was one of the most exciting dimensions of your work, because it opened up for me the possibility of potentially historicizing folks like Dory Laub and Shoshana Feldman, and even, Levinas. And these are people, thinkers that I deeply revere. I went through long phases of Levinas worship. And if you don't believe me, just check my graduate student seminar papers, with which, Todd, you were one of the many who were tortured. And I went through that period, but I think coming out of your book, wonder about the kinds of ways in which their work as well might be seen at, this kind of at a distance, a historical distance that is, as belonging to a certain era, as contingent upon the kind of technical and scholarly means available to them at that time, the conversations that were happening at that time. We've moved into a different era now, and I wonder whether we can properly situate these thinkers in their own time frame and properly move into another time frame. So, to frame this next question somewhat, you and I are both literary scholars, and one of the core assumptions of literary studies belongs to that of Feldman and Laub and Levinas, and that is to say, this investigation or interpretation of literary objects, including testimony, through what's called close reading, a term that you've referenced earlier, but I want to fully define here. And to give that brief definition of close reading for listeners, close reading is a practice of interpretation that rests on the idea that we can understand the design of a text as a whole, not just fictions, but testimony or rhetoric writ large, by investigating individual words or phrases in that text, and that, in fact, to understand the text as a whole, how it operates, how it, so to speak, thinks, we should look at the very smallest units of that text to see which kinds of patterns are visible under that kind of microscope. And for those who investigate text using close reading, that kind of intimate inspection holds up the possibility of opening up the broader text to a deeper understanding of its inner workings or system. And in fact, this method of interpretation has become very popular. In some fields, it's kind of seen as the de facto form of analysis. And it's the method of kind of cultural studies that operates in our culture writ large. It's the method that the Supreme Court uses to examine the Constitution, to make claims about the document and what it intended us to do as we encounter challenging questions about our present society. It's also the context of the ethical principles that we just discussed, a basic assumption of how to ethically probe Holocaust testimony. That is to say, to look very deeply at individual dimensions of individual texts thoroughly, and to understand what those witnesses might want to say about their experiences, but that might in fact be unsayable, with an understanding that what is written does not get at the entirety of the experience. And so it is the task of the reader to recover that experience by looking deeply with the kinds of spectacles that close reading provides into that text. The problem with that you've already hinted at, is that with so many texts, we can only do this with a kind of a micro set of the testimonies, and this requires us to dismiss the broader diversity of testimonies. And the phrase that Franco Moretti, who you've already brought up, suggests to describe this kind of phenomenon is the slaughterhouse of literature, a phrase that I think so poignantly refers to the kind of catastrophe of the limits of what we can inspect and understand about Holocaust testimony when we only focus on a few and disregard the broader context of those testimonies, with that kind of violence, I think, attached to the phrase. And the ethical philosophies that I mentioned, attributed to thinkers like Dory Laub and Shoshana Feldman and Emmanuel Levinas, emerged at a time when close reading really was the singular paradigm of interpretation in the humanities. But now, as your book shows, we have new tools, distant reading, as you called it, and as Moretti called it, and new paradigms of interpretation. And those paradigms also make a claim about an ethics of interpretation. And it seems possible to me, as I've said, to historicize the ethical assumptions about interpretation made by these thinkers and to specifically historicize them in terms of the history of technology in which their philosophies might be entwined. And if what I'm suggesting is indeed possible, we might say that our technologies might be actually changing our ethics, specifically in the context of what we can understand those ethics to be in the scope of Holocaust representation and interpretation. Can you react to that or respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think that you really laid out the stakes crystal clear, Deb, and I really appreciate that. I'm sure your listeners do as well. I think that close reading as a practice, and that I think is in the humanities, it goes back, for centuries, really to medieval times, to biblical interpretation, exegetical work, and so forth. But the idea ultimately is you have a very finite number of texts that you're working with, and you're working them over and over again. And it's a kind of also, I think, a kind of authority that comes not only with those texts, but also like who has access to them and what tools are being used. And I'd say close reading, at least in the 20th century, becomes kind of connected with some changes in media, like linear media, like film, but obviously kind of, long form, narrative. And the ethics really do come about with that kind of the way of thinking about the technology and thinking about how do we engage with it. Well, with regard to like distant reading, you're talking about network media. So as opposed to linear media, like film and books, you're talking about big data. You're talking about networks. You're talking about using computational and statistical approaches that are simply able to work with much more material. And I hesitate to call it data here, but I'm calling it artifacts, testimonies, historical material, and to do so in ways that are deeply, I'd say, comparative and able to react and find different kinds of patterns, different kinds of attention mechanisms. And again, to really think about maybe some of the core assumptions that are even built into the ways in which we access testimonies through certain, digital archives, which again tend to replicate that one-on-one aspect. So, for me, I don't actually contrast the two as in like we're either doing distant reading or close reading, distant listening or close listening. I'm trying to pair the two, right? As to say, I'm trying to expand the repertoire of what humanists or humanities scholars are doing. That is to say, there's benefits to both. Sometimes, in the book, we'll look at kind of like the entire archive of the Shoah Foundation in terms of its metadata, in terms of like the way in which the narrative structures exist. And then we'll hone in to very specific kind of micro expressions that the technologies can also help us to understand in terms of their singularity or their contingency or their uniqueness in the context of a testimony itself or within the context of the archive itself. And so I'm trying to always kind of move in the book between distant and close approaches, not to say one or the other, but it's really a kind of a both and approach. There's also the idea of there's a kind of democratization of witnessing that comes from, working with big data. I mean, you use the term slaughterhouse of literature, and that is Moretti's term, of course, to talk about that 99.6% of literature is simply not read, right? It's written, it exists in libraries, but we don't teach it. We don't work on it. And I'd say there's something probably analogous with regard to testimonies. You can wonder, how much are we able to comprehend? How much are we able to read, especially when we're talking about events of such scale, mass testimony or mass atrocity. There's some really interesting work being done in legal studies. And I want to mention my colleague at the Hebrew University, Renana Kedar, in this regard. And she's calling for the idea that it might be possible to imagine something that she calls a mass testimony, utilizing computational tools that would help us to understand, and bring many thousands of witness accounts into the historical record. There's huge legal consequence here, right? How many testimonies can a judge or a jury ultimately hear and comprehend and remember? And so can computational tools be used to help us to parse and admit into the record, right? Thousands upon thousands of witness accounts who may have many different perspectives, many of which may be allied, that is to say they may align with one another, but others of which perhaps provide new information, right? New perspectives that hadn't been fully appreciated. And so there's also, consequences, in legal, juridical domains, epistemological consequences, this idea of a kind of democratization of witnessing that could come through a sort of a big data approach. I think is very exciting, not just for historical scholarship, but potentially for legal scholarship and even legal process, where, we want to, ostensibly admit many victim accounts and give them voice. But, we do run up against a question as to like, how do we really do that? And maybe there's ways of thinking here that could allow us to expand how those voices are admitted and participate in the creation of a record about an event like a mass atrocity.
We are just about out of time. In fact, we are over time, probably at the limits of your bladder and your attention.
Yep.
But I do want to ask you one last question before we sign off. I like to say that prophecy is the scourge of journalism and prognostication is the enemy of good scholarship. So I hesitate in asking this question, but I'll ask it anyway. If you had to think ahead to the next generation of Holocaust scholarship, given these tools and what you're suggesting in the argument that stands out in the book, what do you think that next generation of Holocaust scholarship looks like? Where do we go from here?
Well, I mean, I think that, this idea around integrated methodologies is going to be really exciting. That historians who are able to bring around using digital computational tools, modeling, a kind of a union of quantitative and qualitative methods of thinking about data and narrative, numbers and voices, statistical, historical approaches, say structures and people, distant and close, theory and practice, right? This is all changing the way in which, humanities scholars and historians are working. And it's also changing the way in which, I'd say the general public is also accessing and understanding, events like the Holocaust or other complex, large, global historical events, because we have the ability to develop these approaches, these methods, right, that are able to expand witnessing, able to expand analysis, that attend to things that haven't been fully understood or being understood in new ways. So I'm really excited about what the implications would be for humanities disciplines that are then thinking in terms of integrated methodologies. And I do think, the question of AI, will continue to both haunt us and offer opportunities. I'm not, one who's going to want to stick my head in the sand and say, avoid it. But I think that there are very real, questions around authenticity and the importance of the historical record. And there's a recent UNESCO report on AI and the Holocaust that I think, really focuses in on some of those issues. And there's no question that we're going to have to continue to confront them. But I also think, I have a lab right now working on AI and cultural heritage. And what we're interested in doing is developing responsible practices for how AI can be used to enhance metadata, to provide new avenues for access, to help us clarify or add context to historical sources that's accurate, that's truthful, that's correct, that's explainable, that's authenticated. And I think that this is going to be a huge area. I call it in the book, I end with an idea around digital provenance, which is basically giving an account of how the algorithm or the AI or the decision-making functioned. How did it work? How does it work in order to preserve rather than undermine authenticity? And here I'm referencing, work by a lot of folks in critical algorithm studies, not least of all like Emily Bender and Temnet Gebru. But the point here is that we will have to be giving an account of how these technologies work and the decision-making. And I think that there are a lot of possibilities that are changing the way in which humanities scholarship going forward will look and how it'll work. So I think it's a lot of excitement, to be honest, and maybe not prognostication, as you say, but really, I think, new avenues for historical scholarship. So thank you, Deb.
Thank you so much, Todd.